Hello and welcome to Big Ideas. My name's Emma Ayres. This Big Ideas is about music and emotion. Now, I'm sure that you've been into a shop, for instance, and the music playing in the shop has made you feel so anxious and so angry that you've had to walk straight out. It's possible that you've heard a piece of music which has made you weep completely by surprise. Or maybe a piece of music which you haven't heard for decades has made you remember something from your childhood, something that you never thought that you would remember. So music certainly stirs great emotions in us. And here to talk about this today, I'm delighted to be joined by these two professors, Professor Andrew Schultz and Associate Professor Emery Schubert. Emery, can I start with you? So what happens when we listen to music? What happens to us in a physical sense?
Okay, I was going to say you summed it up, what happens like when you go into shops and listen to music, but from a more psychological research perspective, obviously the sound enters the ears and then it's processed in the mind, and the mental processing is incredibly complex. A lot of activity is happening, and obviously emotion is one thing that happens, and also there's cognitive responses. So some people are interested in the structure and the shape of the music. They're listening to the notes and the patterns. So it's quite different from emotion, but in a way that all feeds in. There's also physiological responses. So your heart rate actually can change in response to music. You can start sweating. You can feel shivers down your spine. A whole range of physical emotion responses, we call them. And also, interestingly, we have motion responses. So in Western culture, we're trained out of moving when we listen to music, in classical culture. Obviously, at the rave concert, you're dancing away. And that's actually repressing something that's probably going on in the brain even when we're not moving. That is, the motor cortex is actually being activated while we're listening to music. There's almost a natural tendency to want to move to music in some way. It's hard for some people to think of that with more classical training because we spend a lot of time learning how to repress that. And I'll stop there for now. There's a few other things.
Well, it's such an enormous subject. I guess because it is about music and emotion. Let's listen to some music. So we're going to hear some music from you, Andrew, and a piece called After Nina. Andrew, what an exquisite piece, After Nina. Why did you write that piece?
Well, the title, After Nina, comes from the Nina Simone version of a song called Strange Fruit. It's a very famous song, and in this song we have depicted for us the image of the bodies of African-American men hanging after a lynching from the poplar trees in the south of the United States. And it's a song originally made famous by Billie Holiday, not originally written by her, written before her, and then later versions of it included the one by Nina Simone. Now, what attracted me about the Nina Simone version of this song was the simple and interesting way she dealt with a whole series of low bass chords in the piano, chords she played herself and she sang as well. And it's a very expressive but simple performance, and I found that idea of reducing everything and by just using very simple material in the end to be more potent than a kind of overstated, very emotional kind of presentation. And that was the idea that led me to call the piece After Nina.
As a composer, how does that affect you, writing a piece which, as you say, is so potent, it's so powerful? Does this have an effect on you? Like, do you go out into the world with that kind of emotion in your heart?
Not entirely. I think the sense of writing a piece is a very palpable experience. I like to say that when I'm writing a piece, it's like you've built a room and you're in that room, and when you're writing the work, the room is almost as if it's a physical entity around you. So it has that kind of sense of a real thing, but I don't think that you kind of are obsessing with a particular emotion. It's not like you're saying, well, I've got to express this dark thought or that. It's very much about how the material develops in your own imagination. So, you know, people sometimes say, well, was Mozart sad when he wrote the Requiem? That kind of question, you know, and it's probably too simple to say that's the answer, you know. I think that there's more goes on around the actual engagement with the actual musical ideas and the way that they get translated into something expressive.
Emery, back to you, and as a music psychologist, what's your opinion about how much music can sustain an emotion? Like, if we listen to a piece which is endlessly sad for 5 hours, say, which might be the length of an opera, is that unsustainable as a listener?
It's hard to say. It depends on so many factors. It could be the cultural norm that you just listen to sad music all the time. Generally, there seems to be some sort of a cognitive pressure to want to change the mood of the music. But again, it's a very difficult problem to tease out, because it is, a lot of it is culturally determined. So, but I think Andrew's point was an interesting one, because what I think that question is doing is looking at the process from the listener's perspective, and also the listener culture. In our culture, it's a fascination at what's going on in the composer's head. But the composer is often using intuition, or they might be even doing the painting by numbers sort of approach, where they think, well, actually, I want this chord to sound a particular way, and I know how to do it. Or they just do it, and then someone discovers this incredible effect, and they say, oh, how did the composer do that? So it's a mixture of intuition and knowledge, but that's really more a fascination, I think, for the listener and for the researcher. And I'm not excluding the composer from being a researcher in that sort of respect.
And as a listener, how much does our original mood affect how we perceive a piece? For instance, somebody who is in a particularly sad, possibly even in a depressed place, and they listen to a really happy piece of music, will they perceive it necessarily as a happy piece of music?
Well, the research on mood regulation, it's called, suggests that people, when they're in a sad mood, tend not to pick really happy music immediately, because there's too much of a dissonance, there's too much to cope with. They might pick music that matches the mood, and if they're interested in leaving that space, they might then progressively pick music that's more positive.
But it's a gradual thing.
Usually that's what the research has been saying for the last 5 or 10 years. I mean, it could change that result, but that's what
I think it's interesting that one of the things a composer often does is to create a kind of sense of journey, an emotional journey within a larger piece, particularly where you might move from a mood which is quite sombre or dark to one which becomes quite jubilant as a piece progresses. And I think that sometimes a listener will engage with a work, even one which they don't necessarily entirely understand or feel comfortable with, because they can engage with the journey. you know, this kind of transition through various sort of expressive stages. And I think, so I think that one of the great things about classical music is it doesn't necessarily stay in one emotional place for its entire duration. It can move quite dramatically or even quite quickly or quite slowly. And that sense of experience is, I think, one of the real attractions to listeners as they mature and develop.
Andrew, let's hear another one of your pieces then. So I think we're going to hear the end of one sound.
Okay, yes.
Andrew, an astonishing piece of music, one sound. What were the sort of circumstances that you wrote that in?
Well, I wrote it for the Australia Ensemble this year, beginning of this year, and the idea and the name, One Sound, comes from the idea of the opening of the piece. It's quite a long piece, 14, 15 minutes. We've just heard the end, but the opening of the piece starts just with this one tune, fairly slow, in unison, so just one sound at a time. And the piece gradually evolves into this ending, which we heard. And so the idea is, I had this idea about, borrowed this idea about cells, how cells divide and how they keep being identifiably the same cells, but they keep splitting and multiplying. And it was this idea in musical terms was, how can this musical idea expand and expand and expand until it really sort of bursts out completely at the end. And so the mood there at the end is really one where every instrumental part is doing something a little bit different, but they all kind of contrapuntally but relate as well.
How much, as a composer, do you take different instruments and use them for their sound? For instance, we heard fantastic flautist there, Geoffrey Collins, with his flute playing, and he just makes such a brilliant sound. So how much do you take that sound to invoke a particular mood?
Oh, very much. The instrumental ensemble you're working with really is the thing which is probably most influential on what I do. And also the individual players, not just the actual sort of abstract sound, but the individual players, Jeff and the other players, you know, I know them fairly well, and actually knowing what they do and what they sound like actually does influence you, definitely. And so as you work on a piece too, you often get the chance to meet with players and sit down with them and see what works and what doesn't. And so, you know, definitely the performers are a major influence on the way a piece ends up sounding. And in this piece, the instrumental range of the flute is quite high, and there are parts of the flute that don't travel terribly well because in the lower register the sound is not especially strong, and so a lot of things come into consideration as a composer about how to keep things balanced in this sort of ensemble.
Emery, There seems to be quite a big difference between little kids listening to music and adults listening to music, that they might react to a piece of music in really quite a different way. Is that something that's played out in your research?
Well, the research about development of emotion in music suggests that up until about the age of 7, children are using more simple sort of cues to figure out the meaning in the music. So, for example, this is not a rule, but generally 4 or 5-year-olds and lower, to figure out whether a piece is happy or sad, tend to use tempo, the speed of the music and how loud, the dynamics. They don't use mode, they don't use a major and minor mode, they start using that, transitioning in from about 4, 5, 6. By 7, children are responding to music emotionally, we believe, so far according to the research, at pretty much adult levels. So in that respect, in terms of what they understand and respond to emotionally, it's already set. It's like that 7 Up series, isn't it?
Wow, that's really amazing. And so you listen to one piece your whole life, from a little baby through to into your 90s. Will you therefore have quite a different reaction to that piece as you age?
Well, there's also another interesting period from around that age of 7 to 9 years old, we think, which is a period that's sometimes referred to as open-earedness, where you're very open to listening to all sorts of new styles of music, and that window closes. So by the time you get to your teenage years, again, typically, and this is all very culturally loaded, but looking at our culture, teenagers tend to use music more for identity, so it locks in their musical tastes and preferences. And then there's another window that comes to the close around the 20s, typically, according to the research, where you start to settle in your taste.
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking about Triple J now.
Yes, there you go. Yeah. I can bet what age you were when you were listening to Triple J. Maybe you weren't. And so we think that from the 30s onwards, people's tastes tend to lock in. So they're less open to new experiences, and they might hear a new piece of music and say, well, that's not even music, I don't like that. So it's actually, in a way, quite a simple answer, but there's a more complex aspect to it as well, of the idea of if you listen to the same piece, there's 2 effects that can happen there. One is that if you listen to a piece often, like you're obsessed by a piece of music, most people eventually will be turned off, they'll get bored of the piece. But if you love a piece and you stop listening to it, and a lot of people do this through self-regulation, they deliberately try not to listen to their favourite piece.
Almost like you wear it out.
Exactly, and people know that psychology sort of without being able to express it. Years later, they'll have this experience that the piece will come out in surprise and have this very powerful experience.
A final question for both of you. Do you feel that a piece of music has failed if it doesn't bring out emotions in the listener?
Oh, definitely not. I don't think emotion is the aim for a composer at all. I think when it happens, it's a byproduct of other things happening artistically. And I don't think that perhaps in film music, and perhaps there are genres of music where people set out to get a particular emotional effect. Like in film music, obviously you want to support an image by getting a kind of empathic response from an audience. But I don't think that that's really what a composer in a classical tradition is primarily about. It's really about an artistic expression, and the integrity in the work can often and sometimes hopefully generate a really strong response from an audience. But it's not actually the primary intention of what you're doing.
Emery?
Well, we've done some research, when I say we, including a colleague in Germany, Gunter Kreutz, where we're looking at this idea of systemising and empathising, that some people are systemisers, they like to work with objects, and empathisers like to work with people. And what we're starting to discover is that there are individual differences. Some people like to engage with music as an object, as look at the extraordinary structure and look at the scale passages. You know, you were talking earlier of what sort of scale that was. Other people just want to empathise and find out the mood. What was the composer thinking, as we discussed earlier? And so we're starting to come up with this idea that there might be music empathisers and music systemisers. So the answer is both are correct. It depends on the individual.
Yeah, I think this is interesting though, because I've come to the same conclusion about the way composers work, because I think there are 2 different types of approach from composers. Some you'll find are very preoccupied with the kind of science of music, in a sense, the whole sonorous world and how musical material has developed and evolved over time. They're kind of exploratory almost. And others are actually very much more concerned with an expressive dimension of music. And it's quite often that you'll find the 2 don't go hand in hand. You'll find one or other tends to run. And in fact, you could see this as kind of classical and romantic dichotomies, you know, that there are these 2 different extremes in the way we make art. You know, on the one hand, very expressive, and the other, very technically concerned with the material.
And do you think it's related also to gender, how people react?
Our research suggests that it is, but we also did it in a way where we statistically demonstrated they're separable, so that there's probably too much jargon there. But generally, so the idea of this systemising, empathising comes from Baron Cohen, who's related to comedian, but I actually don't know the comedian.
Sacha Baron Cohen.
Sacha, yes. And his idea of extreme male brain theory, which is that the male brain is designed, if you like, to systemise, to go out and gather and, you know, find food and feed the family, whereas the female brain is designed to look after the child and keep the family together and so forth. But he's arguing that systemising, empathising doesn't have to be gender specific. So some men can have a lot of empathising, some women can have a lot of systemising. And he's developed these little scales where we can measure it. And
isn't it true that people change over the lifetime too? I mean, I understand that men typically become more empathic as they get older and women less so.
Right.
I mean, I've heard this. I've noticed.
Yeah, it's something to look at. Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, I think... I'm not sure about gender. I mean, you know, if I think of people who react to my music or say, oh, I like that, I don't sort of see ticking a box, oh, male, female, you know, I would say, you know, you tend to get reactions from both genders.
Thanks so much for joining us here on Big Ideas. Thank you so much to the two professors, Professor Andrew Schultz and Associate Professor Emery Schubert. And thank you also to the brilliant musicians of the Australia Ensemble at the University of New South Wales.